So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome here, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. Good afternoon in our time, good evening and good morning. So my name is, maybe most of you know, is Angelika Messner. I'm speaking here in my function as the president of IASTAM. And let me say just one or two words. One of the major findings of the COVID-19 pandemic is that individual actions are important, but not nearly enough to make the changes we need to address climate change and to have a healthier society. Asian medicines right now reveal as crucially valuable resources in terms of medical intervention in Asian contexts as well as all over the world. Asian medicines so far have been studied in terms of their culturally informed histories of specific contagious diseases, narratives of resistance or accommodation of the relational blending of modern hygiene and indigenous knowledge with regard to epidemics and pandemics. The current pandemic, however, forces us to re-examine the encounter between different medical histories and tragedies and epistemologies. History, to be sure, provides an orientation frame in a meaningful way. However, we need to ask, what can history teach us about the current challenges? So this is a major issue of our webinars series. So this question, what can history teach us? And now a few words on the IASTAM, the International Association for the Study of Traditional Asian Medicines, since 40 years by now, is committed to doing research in medical knowledge that is vital for a circular health. And we can also talk afterwards about these. In other words, on the grounds of the close linkages between the human, the animal and environmental health, IASTAM unites scholars such as medical historians, anthropologists, specialists in life science, translators, ethnobotanists, and practitioners of traditional medicines in Asia and beyond. IASTAM has emerged as a key advocate for incorporating the combining academic research of the clinical, socio-political, and historical sides of medical cultures within Asia and in global contexts. And now COVID-19 forces us to cooperate maybe in, again, new ways. Take, for instance, the fact that South Korea and the US had their first diagnosed cases of COVID-19 on the same day. South Korea has been doing the opposite of the US by rolling out rapid, widespread testing from the very beginning on. The information coming from South Korea has been tremendously valuable in trying to determine how this virus operates and so on. Similarly, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and China have effectively controlled transmission through a variety of measures and also in terms of therapy and aftercare. It is now that we have the chance to develop sustainable healthy societies. This cannot be done without recognizing the significance of the so-called traditional medicines, be they practiced in Asian, in African, or in Western contexts. IASTAM here plays a core role. So for this is now I end. I'm just so happy to have you all here for this webinar. We are really happy to have three highly recognized scholars in their fields. We have Monica Green, historian from Arizona State University, Volker Scheid, both historian and practitioner of Chinese medicine, London, and David Napier, medical anthropologist, University College of London. And finally, Ronit Yolitlali, Goldsmith, University of London. She is currently editing a volume on pandemic and Asian medicines for our IASTAM journal, Asian Medicine. And so I'm so happy she acts as a moderator through this webinar. And so I'll hand over to you, Ronit, now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a small correction, co-editing with Michael Stanley Baker.
Oh, yes.
Glad to see everyone here. So the title of this first webinar is the Pan and the Pandemics. This is actually an expression from Monica. We're not going to talk about the god Pan today, but try to think about Pan in the sense of involving all members. And then begin to think about this question of why and how Asian approaches matter. And these Asian approaches are of various types. As Angelica mentioned, some. So there is the issue of history, there is the issue of practice, there is the issue of public health. These are the obvious ones, but there are many others too, which hopefully we will start to think about as these webinars progress. Today is the first webinar, and we are planning to continue them from October onwards. But today we begin with 3 angles that can help us begin to think about some of the bigger questions that that we can think about. So today is a kind of preliminary exploration. So we have 3 presentations of 15 to 20 minutes each. And after that, we'll open the floor first to the panelists to discuss between themselves, to ask questions, and then we'll open to the Zoom global floor to ask questions. If you want to ask questions, please write them down in the chat, and we'll try to keep track of the question. So let us begin. We begin, as such explorations should begin, with the historical angle from Professor Monica Green. So Monica Green has been really a tour de force, not only in her primary field of medieval European medicine, but also an advocate of the need to go global, to globalize history of medicine. And especially in the last decade or so, she has published some really groundbreaking work in the history of infectious diseases in the pre-modern world, work that is increasingly taking a global approach. So while as we are scholars working on Asian medicine, we like to think that what we study matters. We are even more happy when we hear it from Europeanists. So without further ado, Monica, please.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm going to switch to share screen so everybody can see my screen. And oh, and I have too many files open. There we go. And slideshow. And all right. Excellent. Thank you so much, Ronit. And just to reinforce anybody who missed it, I am a Europeanist. The majority of my career has been researching matters uniquely of concern to European medicine. Those are my languages as well. So I'm very much an interloper as soon as I step outside of the boundaries of Europe. And let me say too, that I have always been aware of that interloper status because European medicine is itself so deeply indebted to Islamic medicine in the medieval period, which I study. So there has never been a way in which European medicine, in terms of its content, in terms of its ideas, in terms of its pharmacopoeia, was ever insulated, or certainly not since the 11th century when the major translation movements began. But there are ways in which the scope of what we need to consider in the field of history of medicine has expanded even more in the last few years, and that's what I want to talk about today. And that is my new trajectory, which is genetics. And the basic argument that I want to make today is genetic gives us a common language to talk about the history of disease. I won't be talking about therapeutics or medical practices per se. I will actually be talking about the diseases that are commonly present in much of the old world and at a certain point become, after European colonialization, become global diseases. So I want to talk about narratives of disease. I also want to talk about geographies of blame. And my objective is to separate those by the end of the talk, but to make an argument about how they fit together. So I will be talking about the ways in which genetics has transformed almost everything we can know about the history of infectious diseases. And there are different diseases that not all these stories can be told with such detail, with such richness, yet for a variety of reasons that are technical to this aspect of genetics. But I'm a medievalist, and as a medievalist, there have always been two major infectious diseases that we knew we needed to talk about, which are plague and leprosy. And those are the two that I want to talk about today. So what we know about Yersinia pestis, which is the bacterium that causes plague, is entirely summed up in the phylogenetic tree that I'm showing you today. Phylogenetic tree is a family tree. It's showing evolutionary connections of different strains of, in this case, different strains of the plague bacillus. The entire global history of plague is shown in this one diagram. And that is the amazing, astounding, earth-shattering effect of this new kind of genetics that can be done. And so what is being done is genetics does two things with respect to the history of the pathogen that causes infectious diseases. It can take modern samples of the organism, sequence them, and once you have the full genomic sequence, you can then figure out familial relationships. So just as if you took all your cousins and second cousins and third cousins and sequence everybody's genes, you could figure out who's the parent, who were the common grandparents, and so forth. So that's the work that's done from modern samples. That's the present day sample. How you get resolution historically is when you can then add old samples. And that's what aDNA is. A stands for ancient, DNA. That's all that it is. And this has been retrieved from human remains of people who died in prior times. So aDNA work is being done both on plague and on leprosy and several other diseases as well now. So what does this diagram show us? It shows us the third plague pandemic. Now, what I'm going to be doing is this is showing familial relationships and giving a sense of change over time. So there is some time depth in the organization of this tree. It's not giving you any geography. And so listen to the geographic signals as I talk about these different stages of the organism's development. So the third plague pandemic, I'm sure you're all aware, is the pandemic that does have its origin in Southwest China, coming out of Yunnan, spreading by the end of the 19th century to Hong Kong, getting on steamboats, and then spreading around the world. So I live in Arizona. We have plague in Arizona. It came to California around 1900 and then spread eastward. So most of the US. That's a third plague pandemic, so all those blue. The other thing I should say now is that the shaded areas on this, so here, here, and here, those are genomes of Yersinia pestis that have been retrieved from historical samples. So those are all ADNA. So everything we know about the Black Death right now, at least in terms of the phylogenetics, is from ADNA samples. And those have all been done from Europe, only from Europe. And that's a function of kind of how archaeology gets done, how science gets funded, and several other things. But that is an evidence bias that we have to reckon with now. Next is the Justinianic plague. Again, we're going further back in time. This is the 6th to 8th century of the Common Era. And this again is European samples for an outbreak of plague that strikes the Mediterranean basin. And then look at this big long branch of the tree, and the earliest branch. That's entirely a reconstruction that has happened since 2015. We had no idea that this earlier proliferation of plague happened. So that's the late Neolithic Bronze Age. Now the geography of all of this is it is spread across Eurasia. The old samples are spread across Eurasia. Plague, at least every indication that we have right now, plague is a disease of Northern Eurasian origin. And there's a story in there that possibly includes horses, and I can talk to you about that later. But again, I'm a medievalist, so where I come into this larger story of plague's history is the Black Death. The Black Death has been told, and it was told by me as a teacher in the classroom, as a European story, or as a Mediterranean story, that plague emerges out of the Black Sea, gets passed into the Mediterranean, and then strikes the Middle East, North Africa, and all of Europe. And those are the stories that we tell out of our historical documents, out of Boccaccio in the Decameron, telling these stories of mass death, terror, flight, and various other things. And it is told as a 14th century story. Genetics actually says, wait a minute, something happened before the Black Death. And so that's what I have spent the last 4 years looking for, is what is that pre-Black Death story? And where is that pre-Black Death story? And what I've been able to do is, and this is now adding genetics evidence to documentary evidence, to a certain extent linguistic evidence, then I've been able to elicit from a variety of very generous colleagues, this is the narratives that I tell now, which is that the Mongols are the principal agent in disseminating plague into new territories, disseminating specific, actually a specific strain that they encounter in the Tian Shan Mountains in what is now Kyrgyzstan, and then spreading it to these other areas. And so in Chinese evidence, we have stories of plague outbreaks at the time of Mongol sieges. And what I've just
So what happened to Jews?
Questions will come afterwards. The Hulagu on his campaign into Iran and Iraq, and ultimately Syria in the 1250s, carries plague with him as well. So these are the new narratives. I wouldn't have even been asking these questions if the genetics had not already put on the table the issue of something else was happening. And what this does is also explain a lot of inconsistencies that we've been telling in the stories about Black. So again, I can go into more detail about these after, but that's one of the ways in which narratives of the landscape and narratives about origin and dissemination of disease can be transformed with this new evidence that genetics has given us. Now, leprosy. Here I'm starting at from a different angle and starting with a late 19th century colonial map. And I'm sorry it's rather fuzzy, but that was the best I could find on short order today. But you can get a good enough sense of what it's indicating. It's showing leprosy distributed throughout the world. It's showing leprosy distributed around the world in the colonial context of the 1890s. And this basic map will inform the ways that leprosy gets talked about for the next 150 years, including the current narratives that we work with, that leprosy is a tropical disease. There's nothing more fictitious than calling leprosy a tropical disease, and I'll show you why. So one of the things that was suggested about leprosy 15 years ago, when the first genetic studies were being done, the phylogenetic studies that were being done, and those were from modern samples. So leprosy is present in throughout the South, the global South, and primarily. And so the narrative about leprosy, in terms of its history and particularly its genetic history, was that it is an out of Africa story. This study just came out in 2020, and it's building on 15 years of these analyses. And I won't read the entire text there, but it's focusing on the strains of plague in Madagascar. And it's suggesting that the strains of plague that are uniquely found in Madagascar and Malawi didn't arrive before the 9th century of the Common Era. And it's very thinly indicated there, but it's coming from the north. That leprosy is arriving as a new disease in Madagascar, certainly not before the 9th century, and perhaps even later. So anyway, but Africa has 4 of the 6 lineages of leprosy, which was part of the reason why it was assumed to be an origin. But, and this is the section that I've highlighted there, the most ancestral lineage of M. leprae, branch 0, has not been reported in Africa. Altogether, these data suggest that human migrations have mainly contributed to the introduction of different M. leprae genotypes from elsewhere into Africa. So if it's not of African origin, where is it from? Well, this is a study that was published earlier that draws on ADNA. And again, with leprosy, all we have right now is European samples, but we can still make some larger historical inferences from this. And what that ADNA shows us is, where is lineage 0 found? It's found in Hungary in the 7th, 8th century of the Common Era. It's found in Denmark of the 11th or 12th century of the Common Era. Modern samples are almost uniquely found on the Pacific Rim. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that leprosy story, and this is my historical inference from the genetics information that's available right now, I think leprosy is coming from the subarctic circle. I think it's a zoonosis that's being transmitted to humans. In the story, then, is that our histories of medicine have been created, the discipline of history of medicine has mostly been created in the late 19th and 20th century. It was using those colonialist understandings of the distribution of leprosy. It was seeing leprosy as a disease that was found everywhere, leaving aside Norway. It was found everywhere in these tropical environments. It was found everywhere in these, shall we say, backward in environments. And without seeing, without any recognition of a larger, deeper history that implicated Europe in the transmission of the disease in the Middle Ages. So how does that bring us to the present day? It brings us to the present day by actually indicating that all of our disease narratives need to be reinterrogated in these ways. And we have the opportunity now to watch and monitor the way we are constructing disease narratives about COVID-19. It may be that the story begins and ends in that wet market in Wuhan. What is the benefit of focusing on origins, or even bringing in the whole concept of blame? My argument is we should take blame and throw it out the window. We should engage in the new opportunity that we have to tell news stories about the history of disease. And in terms of now connecting that to medicine, which is the main topic we need to talk about today, is think about the ways in which as I understand it, both Asia and Europe and major parts of Africa as well, were all presented with the new disease of leprosy starting about 3,000 years ago. And what does that mean in terms of the development of medical interventions? What does that mean in terms of the development of social interventions? What does that mean in terms of the language of leprosy? What does that mean in terms of the concepts of leprosy? We can ask these new questions now. So I will turn it over to the next speaker now. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, our next speaker is Volker Scheid, who's both a leading practitioner and also a leading researcher of Chinese medicine. As a researcher, he's published widely on the history and development of Chinese medicine. He's considered one of Europe's leading practitioners of Chinese medicine, and being both a historian and a practitioner allows him to reflect on current practice from a broader historical perspective. So today he'll speak to us about some moments in the current encounter between Chinese medicine and COVID-19. Volker.
Okay, thanks to Angelica and you for inviting me. Yeah, let me try to share my screen. Okay. Okay. So I will talk about 3 moments, what I call 3 moments in the ongoing encounter between Chinese medicine and COVID-19. As Ronnie just said, I'm both a practitioner, and as a practitioner, I'm treating patients with COVID-19 for the last 3-4 months. So I have some direct experience with it. But both as a practitioner and a historian, at the moment, I'm actually quite a bit less interested in stories or narratives, but rather than in moments where different things come together, not in a kind of linear fashion, but in complicated ways. And I think this encounter between Chinese medicine and COVID-19 is a very it's very interesting in that sense, because there's not any kind of real story yet to be told, but it's rather bits and pieces. And I just want to give you three of these moments without making any claim that there's a kind of like underlying super narrative to be constructed from that. Okay, so the first moment is what I call is the encounter between what I call the liberal elite and Chinese medicine and COVID-19. What I mean by the liberal elite, that those are the people who I think if you would talk to them, they would kind of like espouse some kind of enlightenment values in truth. They would be very critical of people like Donald Trump and his campaign against fake news. And those are the people who write in newspapers in the UK, like the Times or the Guardian. In Germany, the Süddeutsche, Spiegel, Scheid, and Le Monde, and papers like that. So this is a recent article from the Times. Similar things, the Sunday Times, similar things have appeared in the Guardian, also in German papers. I don't know about America. And here you see the quackery and communism go together. And this is a type of article that appears regular for the last 15 years, at least 15 to 20 years. And COVID is just a new opportunity for that to do. Basically, the argument here is in two sentences. Chinese medicine is crap. However, for some reasons, it is promoted in China, basically by the bad communists who have promoted it for some ideological nationalist reasons. But Chinese medicine is very, very, of course, ineffective. And the other thing is the animal angle that always gets dragged out. The animal angle here being, on the one hand, that Chinese medicine is, of course, very, very bad because it uses endangered species. And even more so in COVID-19 because of the possible relationship between pangolins and the transmission of disease. And Chinese medicine uses, at least not anymore, but traditionally pangolin scales. So obviously there's this angle, Chinese medicine could actually be one of the causes of the COVID-19 epidemic. Now, if you look at, if you would look at all the claims made in this article, every single factual claim in this particular article is wrong, yes, okay? So this is a piece of fake news produced by the opponents of fake news. You know, for one claim is that Chinese medicine was prohibited in 1929. That's wrong. The idea that's promoted here that, I mean, if you would, the story is, so to speak, that Mao Zedong, this strange person in the Chinese Communist Party, they are a kind of abnormality in the world for promoting Chinese medicine. The idea here being, if they would be rational people, then of course they wouldn't do that. This of course isolates China in a kind of like a global context. If you look at East Asia in general, Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan, all these countries, of course, promote traditional medicines. The idea here, for instance, I find very interesting that people writing in this very, very specific moment in the UK, criticizing a country like China for a kind of exceptionalist position in the world, rather than being part of a global rational community of people, at a moment where England is in the grip of some, some people would say, of some irrational exceptionalism. I find also very interesting. The other angle, of course, is the endangered species angle. So Chinese medicine here is accused of using these endangered species. On a certain level, this argument, because in the pharmacopoeia, in the Chinese pharmacopoeia, these rhino horn, tiger bones, pangolin scales, they are no longer included. So even so, if this was so in the past, it's no longer so in the present. However, there is, of course, illegal trade, but Chinese medicine is not responsible for this illegal trade. The argument, would be, to me, very similar if you would say Western medicine at one time used cocaine and heroin. There is an illegal trade in cocaine and heroin, so therefore Western medicine is responsible for this illegal trade in cocaine and heroin. It also totally negates the idea that Western medicine itself is very much involved in problematic use of animals, including here in COVID-19. I don't know if you know, the horseshoe crab blood is key to vaccine testing, and that is putting a very strong ecological strain on horseshoe crabs. But horseshoe crabs are also, their blood is harvested for all kind of other medical research purposes, and is threatening the survival of this particular species. But of course, there's many other problems involved in the use of animals in Western medicine, both historically and at the present. So what I'm really interested in is, how come this particular type of Westerner, liberal, educated people, need to find, each time China comes up, and particularly if each time Chinese medicine comes up, why are they so kind of like allergic to the possibility that Chinese medicine, or any kind of traditional medicine for that matter, but Chinese medicine here is a typical thing, could make a contribution to local or global healthcare. What is it that gets them so irate? And why is it okay for these people to be practitioners of fake news in this particular encounter when they would be the first critics of fake news in other encounters? So that's just a question. So the second encounter is an encounter between COVID-19 and what I would call the Chinese medicine elite. I call them the Chinese medicine elite because those are the people who write books, who are very active on the internet. They are the kind of influencers. You know, I don't have so much access to the practitioners who just practice. So this is what I call the Chinese medical elite. A little bit, for those who don't know Chinese medicine, one of the ways we could write the history of Chinese medicine is as a history of engagement with epidemics epidemics in China. And important epidemics have been in the history of Chinese medicine really important turning points where because treatments didn't work, new ideas came about. These are just three really important turning points in the history of Chinese medicine. At the end of the Han Dynasty, the emergence of a very, very important work called the Treatise on Cold Damage. In the 13th century, again, a really important turning point, another kind of tradition of Chinese medicine emerging there. And then again in the late Ming. I don't want to talk, I haven't got the time to talk through these changes. It's important just to note that there were changes, and we could put the encounter between the epidemics and the failure of Chinese medicine to work in particular periods of time as a main contributor to the development of Chinese medical knowledge. So just to give you, so if you look at here, the 2216 Treatise on Cold Damage, this Treatise on Cold Damage became in the 10th, 11th century a key work for treating feverish diseases. Those are the kind of, in as much as a lot of infectious diseases start with fevers, also then for infectious and epidemic diseases. This is a passage from one of the of an important text written in the 16th century, 17th century, about practitioners using this treatise on cold damage to treat the epidemic disorders of the late 16th and mid 17th century. So here you see the practitioners of the time erroneously used cold damage methods to treat it. I never saw a case of theirs that did not get worse. So the failure of treatment, particularly of this cold damage in this particular case, becomes the stimulus for creating a new perspective, new treatments. What is really interesting to me, both as a practitioner and historian, in the context of COVID-19, whereas previously in any kind of epidemic, one of the main themes is failure. If I look at everything almost that comes both out of China or here in the West amongst these influencers, it's success. So this is somebody, I don't want to give any names because then people think I might be attacking particular people, but this is an influencer writing here from the West. So the position vis-a-vis this treatment of COVID is we have the principles, we have the formulas, doesn't matter what kind of virus is, it works. Yes, okay, so it works. So, and also if you look at what comes out of China, the stories are always of great success. Chinese medicine works, it's fantastic. So it's very different than previously. One of the claims I would like to make, or I think one of the things that is behind this is that Chinese medicine no longer carries a burden. Whereas in all those previous epidemics, Chinese medicine really carried the burden. It was responsible for treatment of the populace. Nowadays, it's kind of like an add-on option. If it works, you can celebrate the success. If it doesn't work, you just put them or they will already, of course, be in a Western medicine emergency ICU unit. The other thing is really interesting. One of the things, this is more like internal Chinese medicine politics, but this book here that the Treatise of Cold Damage has become, how shall I say, the central text in a certain kind of modern renaissance of a certain type of Chinese medicine. Again, the very multifactorial origins, but I would say it's tied to the kind of Chinese nationalism that's becoming very important, but it's also a reaction against the perceived biomedicalization of Chinese medicine that has been taken place over the last 50, 60, or 100 years, depending on how long you want to go back. And it's a kind of a yearning for the authenticity of the most ancient medicine in China. And it centers very much around this text called the Shanghan Lun. So this is from another influencer. He's a Chinese person, but it's translated by a Westerner. So I don't know who is doing the what I would also call this slight distortion of truth. So on the one hand, so this person is very, very famous in China. He's made his name for the last 30 years by actually promoting this kind of the Shanghan Lun as a kind of most authentic version of Chinese medicine. And he went to Wuhan and treated some people there. So he says he went there, or his group of people went there, and what they encountered was that actually the Shanghan Lun, its theories became verified. Yes, okay, again, look at the contrast between what happened previously. In every other epidemic, people find that the Shanghan Lun actually doesn't work as well as it has been claimed, but now it's been verified. There's also a very interesting thing here in the way the title is translated. Normally it's translated like the discourse on cold damage disorders. Here it's translated in this context, discourse on epidemic disorders caused by cold. And epidemic is of course put in brackets. So it's claimed here that this text is specific for epidemics. The same person would claim in another context that actually the Shanghan Lun, this text, is not for epidemic disorders, but it's a text that describes, that is universally applicable to all kinds of disorders. So again, there is some kind of manipulation of facts going on here to create a reality that's more maybe suitable to what you want to see. In this is also from the same paper. He makes certain other claims that are actually factually wrong. And the last sentence, if you read that, I'm sounding like an advertisement for the Shanghan theory, but it really is the truth. But actually for somebody who's made his money and name by actually being a promoter of the Shanghan Lun, and who then finds out actually that everything he ever said is actually really the truth, showed by COVID-19, it's a bit different than it was historically. So that's my thing about the Chinese medicine community. And then there's something else that I find quite interesting in this encounter between Chinese medicine, between COVID-19 and both Chinese medicine, and I call it here Western medicine, but better I should call it modern biomedicine. For those who know Chinese medicine, over the last 100 years, one of the kind of slogans to distinguish Chinese medicine and Western medicine is Chinese medicine differentiates patterns. So what that means is Chinese medicine treats on the basis of constellating certain manifestations of an illness into patterns that can be treated. Whereas Western medicine differentiates diseases. And this is like a common slogan that everybody knows and everybody claims. And it emerged in the kind of 1930s. Yang Zemin here from, this is a book from 1936. Yang Zemin is one of the people who is kind of like responsible for coining this slogan, yes. And he writes here, the goal of differentiating, so he says Chinese medicine emphasizes the treatment of patterns, Western medicine emphasizes knowing disease. And the idea here very much is that Chinese medicine is very good at constellating symptoms into treatable entities that you can treat, even without necessarily knowing the cause, or even without necessarily knowing what's going on deeper in the body. Whereas Western medicine is very, very good at knowing what, you know, in medical history you would call the lesion. But actually, even if it knows the lesion, it doesn't necessarily know how to treat successfully. This is, of course, 1920s, 1930s history, yes? Okay, when Western medicine knew a lot about lesions, but didn't even have antibiotics, for instance. Its therapeutic armory was very limited. But anyway, this kind of opposition between Chinese medicine being good at patterns and Western medicine being good at knowing diseases has persisted ever since. Now, the interesting thing is that COVID-19 is challenging some of this in many different ways. But this is just an example here from again from the UK. If you look at the response to COVID-19 here in the UK, it was initially defined by, they gave up testing very quickly for political, economic reasons. And then COVID-19 was defined by 3 symptoms. So you had to have fever, sore throat, and there was another one. And then they at some point they added a 4th, loss of smell. So this is, of course, a very clearly a pattern type of approach. And this is one of the key epidemiologists. He said, the only way to confirm a coronavirus infection at this time is by this pattern diagnosis, or was by this pattern diagnosis. And he says, at no any other time in modern Western medicine, biomedicine, would you try and do a differential diagnosis for a respiratory virus based on symptoms alone? Yet here we are with a new virus relying on that because we don't have capacity to test. So in a certain way, one of the ways you could read it, if you want to, Western medicine had to regress to the state of Chinese medicine, but actually it's not really good at it. From a practitioner point of view, it was very clear to me and loads of other practitioners very early on that these 3 symptoms or 4 symptoms, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's many people that would either be called asymptomatic in biomedicine or kind of mildly symptomatic. But if you start to see 5, 10, 15, 20 of these people, you start to see patterns emerging. And these patterns that were emerging to me and to other people that I've talked with, they clearly indicated, even before this was much more widely publicized, that maybe things like the chest or the respiratory system was only just one part of the picture. And that is, of course, now becoming much more clear. This is from this morning's Guardian, you know, warning of serious brain disorders. So this is the idea that COVID-19, I mean, you might know about it, that the lesions in the lung are also just in a certain way symptoms of some other kind of disease process that nobody really has yet a handle on. So in a certain way, we don't know where the lesion is. Maybe there is no lesion, one lesion. Maybe there is, maybe we have to, COVID-19 could also be a way of rethinking actually in biomedicine, what goes on in a disease. Because if there's not just one lesion, but many, many, many different lesions in the brain, in the blood vessels, in various organs, etc., etc., etc. So what is this disease really about? But again, if you look at the conjunction between Chinese medicine and Western medicine, even as Chinese medicine claims it's kind of like independent and it can do its own way of discovering things without knowing about taking in any information from Western medicine. If you actually look what practitioners did, both in China or do nowadays, they of course are more or less in an obvious or maybe implicit way influenced by what they hear and what they pick up from general knowledge about this coronavirus entity. So this is a statement from an influencer in China. So he said, well, it's actually very easy to treat. From Western medicine, we know it's in the lungs. From Chinese medicine, we know it manifests as what is called a damp cold disorder that refer to all that fluid in the lungs and certain types of the way the tongues looked in Chinese patients. So therefore, it's a damp cold disorder in the lung, and the formula for that is this particular formula. I mean, that's of course a problem that Chinese medicine, it's a problem for Chinese medicine, not in COVID, but in almost any disorder that where it takes on biomedical knowledge as part of its recognition of what's going on. Because as I showed you here, the idea that it is a respiratory disease is the idea of maybe March. We are now in July, and it's not just a respiratory disease anymore. So a statement like the one on the right-hand side in Chinese medicine, that yes, it's a damp cold disorder in the lungs, obviously is also no longer true. What I would suggest, if we, and this is kind of like my final statement, bringing again together myself as a practitioner and a historian, what I do think Chinese medicine practitioners are very good at, because they are trained to do that, is discover patterns, see relationship between symptoms without being told what the relationships are. Whereas, however, that doesn't mean you have a treatment, even if some of these influencers suggest that. But I think if you wanted to construct, or there is a, if we were open-minded enough and open-minded, that means open-mindedness both on the side of Chinese medicine and on the side of, the scientist. I think you could use the tools of Chinese medicine practitioners to discover these kind of patterns with much more easily than if you would rely on people who are only trained at reading blood tests. Yes, okay. I could give you some clinical examples, but I haven't got the time for it. But those are my comments on 3 moments in the encounter between Chinese medicine and COVID-19. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Volker. We will now move on to our third speaker, Professor David Napier, who's a professor of medical anthropology at University College London. He's the director of UCL's Science, Medicine and Society Network, the global academic lead on a cross-sectorial collaboration aimed at researching and limiting the rise of type 2 diabetes around the world. And his many research interests include assessing primary healthcare delivery, human well-being, immunology, caring for ethnically diverse populations, and lots more. Today he will give us a view from Bali of the 1980s. So, Professor Napier.
David, where are you? So we made David as, he's a co-host now. David, where are you? Where is he? He's there.
There he is.
But he is there, actually. We made it as we opened, yeah. Ah, he's here. David, please.
Unmute.
Unmute. Unmute, David.
David, we
Unmute.
can't hear you.
There, can you hear me now?
Okay.
Yes, yes.
I'm so
Yes.
sorry, my screen froze, everyone. Please excuse me.
Okay.
I do not have a slide presentation. Given the fact that I was told I had 20 minutes, I will try to keep it to 20 minutes because we only have 90 minutes altogether, don't we, Angelica?
Yes, that's right.
So do you want me to talk now or do you want to
Yes,
post?
please.
Sorry,
Go
okay.
ahead, David.
All right, so
So
I'll
great
give
to
you
have you
something
here.
about my experiences in Indonesia. It's called The Flow of Life. In the early 1980s, I conducted fieldwork on ritual healing in Indonesia. It was fortuitous as the timing coincided with the then emerging HIV/AIDS pandemic. Though the pandemic proved devastating globally, it was my good fortune to witness firsthand how those whose traditions I studied responded to what was at the time a new viral threat. My fieldwork was carried out in Bali, which by then had long become a travel destination for tourists in search of liberation of all sorts, including sexual. At that time, the AIDS crisis was not an abstract, distant topic of discussion, but emerging as a real global threat for which no cure and few therapies existed. So for this deeply religious society, framing the global challenge around indigenous ways of thinking occupied the conversations of many traditional healers. Part of those discussions centered on the nature of infectious diseases, but another part was about globalization and modernity's impact on tradition. For some Balinese, changing ways of life proved unsettling, but for others, modernity should not be opposed to tradition because the vitality of traditional ways is as much about how they adapt and explain present and future phenomena as it is about the past. HIV/AIDS discussions, therefore, focus not only on the illness impacts of foreign tourists, but on national and local differences across Bali and Indonesia, the most culturally diverse country on earth. The fact remains salient. With still more than 700 languages, social boundaries are unavoidable in Indonesia. That's why, following its emergence as a nation in 1945, Indonesia recognized the pressing need for a common tongue. In Bali, however, this need for homogeneity went to the core of beliefs about karma, that is spiritual condition, and dharma, that is social role as a function of spiritual condition. Moreover, beliefs about reincarnation meant that all Balinese did not use the same language when addressing one another. In Bali, there are 3 language levels, each with its own vocabulary. So people of different reincarnated estates can find themselves using different vocabularies when speaking with one another. Emerging nationalism, however, demanded that ancient linguistic registers be replaced in schools with Indonesian, the common Aboriginal Malay employed for trade purposes across Southeast Asian spice islands for thousands of years. Evolving for trade purposes, Indonesian is grammatically simple. It doesn't even have tenses or plural nouns, by the way. While Indonesian served the country's unification needs, it also reflected, as it still does, the region's past engagement with outsiders, and this was where the immunology side of this, containing load words from Sanskrit, Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, Chinese, Portuguese, Dutch, Japanese, and now English, not to mention the other Austronesian languages, of which it is one. What this history means is not only that many outsiders are recognized insiders, but many insiders are perceived outsiders. Indeed, an Indonesian living in Sumatra may understand more words spoken by a person from Malaysia or the Philippines than, say, someone speaking Balinese, not to mention someone speaking any one of the several hundred other languages still currently in use in the country. Indeed, covering almost 2 million kilometers, Indonesia contains more islands with their own languages and traditions than any country in the world. Indonesia's astonishing complexity is reflected in its national slogan, unity through diversity. By the 1970s, this homogenizing process had specific effects on how Balinese interpreted the drivers of illness and well-being, becoming regular topics of conversation among those recording and interpreting traditional ways of thinking and their relationship to modernity. And because illnesses are never only physical in Bali, understanding pathogens and foreign pathogens in particular was and yet is an ongoing occupation, including consideration of everyday practices and religious ideas about creation, about deep time, and about magic. It was the positioning of Bali at this historical moment that made it then an especially interesting place from which to examine the emerging AIDS pandemic and Balinese understandings of viruses more generally. For unlike Islam or Christianity, Balinese religion is based on three dominant ideas considered unacceptable to monotheists. The first is that the world is motivated by multiple conflicting forces, that it is our social role, our collective obligation to keep in balance. An awareness that our ritual engagement with our local environment and local practices allow us better to adjust when danger emerges. For this reason, Balinese religion is about fluid change, known as Agama Tirtha, literally the holy water tradition that has come down to us over time. The socio-religious obligations of all Balinese is to promote a more healthy and wholesome flow of life. The second is that except under extraordinary circumstances, physical death is followed by reincarnation into one's own lineage. In other words, each of us will not only be reincarnated, but eventually reemerge in modified form and at a different time in the same place and within the same family. Accumulated good deeds situating us in a particular social role, not only now, but in past and future lives. Ask a Balinese where they would ideally like to be, and most, if the question makes any sense at all, say here and now, of course, because understanding here and now is the only way to create an improved environment in which later to be reincarnated. Individuals are quite literally the reincarnation of their own ancestors, and children are minutely observed to determine the previous lives from which they have emerged. Third, because everything in the universe is connected, latent power, destructive or creative, can reside not only at the top of the Balinese version of the great chain of being, that is, with the gods or a particular god, but in the most common everyday objects. Even inert things can be vitalized, depending on how we attend to them. Through respecting and nourishing the forces of the cosmos, humble, otherwise inert objects can be brought to life and bear important information that can allow us to adjust more constructively. Those things can help us if we offer them flowers and holy water in light of that acquired vitality, that is, consecrated, or harm us if we bring them to life and then neglect them. Without quibbling over whether Balinese beliefs derive from indigenous forms of animism or from ancient forms of Indian Brahmanism that found their way to Bali well over 1,000 years ago, what these ideas mean concretely is that the Balinese are acutely attuned to creating balance in their local environments. Each of us must do our best both to identify the nature of our social role in its local context and to understand how what we do in the present relates to our historical past and our potential future. To put it in immunological terms, health for the Balinese is all about the human herd and how our social relations with others dispose us. Because even the most inert object contains potential, universal forces can manifest themselves in any number of forms and locations, depending on how and where the forces of life flow. Well-being is less, in other words, about our relation to an abstract and distant supreme being than about our awareness of our obligation to identify which particular manifestation of divine power is at work in our lives today. This outlook has practical implications for both understanding and behavior. The more we focus on and are engaged in daily activities that enhance the healthy flow of life, the more we are attentive to our actions as they relate to others and to the spirit world, the better are our chances of keeping the universe in balance. For ignorance and neglect of our duties will only trouble us over countless lives, not only trouble us over countless life cycles, but tempt chaos and potentially jeopardize universal stability. Now, with these beliefs in mind, one can imagine that a wholly different way of conceptualizing the human immunodeficiency virus, indeed of understanding what viruses are more generally, might emerge in Bali in the early to mid-1980s. And that's just what happened. To understand Balinese views of how viruses such as HIV work, I observed how people interpreted the public health messages that warned citizens against HIV, and especially how it was transmitted unrecognized through intimate contact with others. Predictably, most such international public health messaging was couched in a uniform global narrative about infectious agency, population threat, and world challenges. That HIV was highly contagious, that the virus causing AIDS was an agent that got inside of you but did not immediately show its presence, that it could produce multiple and compounding illnesses, and that after a time, its debilitating activities cause death. Though all of these statements were true in those early days of the pandemic when therapies were quite limited, the way they were understood was not exactly what the World Health Organization had in mind. In other words, while at the global level, HIV/AIDS was perceived as an entirely new challenge, many Balinese felt differently, meaning that public health messaging about the then new pandemic did not always resonate with indigenous thinking. Reading such messages, the initial response of many was expected, given the basic belief system I've described. No, HIV/AIDS was not new at all. It was a thing that ancestors, wise people, and priests had known about for a very long time. It was successful black magic, the practice of harming others without their ever discovering the cause of an illness, or of discovering it so late that the actual source of one's malady was not easily identified. That is what most people thought, and in fact still do believe. In other words, the challenge presented for global health campaigners warning people about a new and lethal epidemic called acquired immunodeficiency syndrome was not the usual one of how to frame new information that local populations were presumably unaware of, but of convincing the public that this threat was not something already well known. Indeed, according to some studies, more than 90% of all deaths in Bali are believed to have a spiritual or magical cause, meaning that HIV's slow emerging morbidity was fully recognizable and explainable. To put it another way, AIDS was not a thing unknown, but too much of a thing already known well and made the more dangerous by neglect. A virus, like any other inert thing, a potential that impacts one's consecrated, that is powerful when infused with the flow of life. Like a rock or a piece of wood, a virus once made potent should not be neglected, especially in places like homes and sleeping quarters where people commingle. And because HIV/AIDS was, as it were, well known to most Balinese, the human herd response was also well defined. To combat the power of neglect, its ability to produce harm, we as humans must work collectively to assure balance in our social lives, or we will find ourselves left out, alienated, and vulnerable. One's family and neighbors, because of their physical proximity, can also harm you as much as help you, meaning that in times of crisis, we must be especially aware of both how the circle of people we accept as insiders can become smaller and smaller, and how such isolation can paradoxically make us less aware also of the very thing we fear. That's why you need to know those around you and their potential impact on how you manage your well-being before you become unwell. For what you do on a daily basis has impacts stretching over countless generations, not only for those around you, but for you yourself as your own ancestor and your own descendant. In short, for Balinese today, COVID-19 is more about just preparedness than the just recovery promoted by the WHO and so many others. But because foreigners share less, if they share at all, the Balinese concern over generational pasts and futures, the kind of danger outsiders pose is different. Their danger is one of ignorance. Indeed, because foreigners are less engaged in Balinese communities, they remain by definition less aware of how what the Balinese call rasa, a word meaning both the verb to feel and the noun sap of life, is transmitted from one person to the next across generation and time by the energy we bring to things otherwise static. Being less aware, outsiders also know little about how consecrating, that is bringing to life, objects, and even consecrated, that is spiritual words, can either enhance health and well-being or create chaos and misfortune. And that's where the Balinese taught me quite a bit about viruses. Because for the Balinese, viruses are like any other inert thing, infused with potential by what we do and by the part we play within the human herd. It was the Balinese who alerted me in the early 1980s to the idea that viruses just might be something inert to which our bodies bring the flow of life, that our B and T cells provide a systematic way of contacting and hopefully managing potentially dangerous information. The Balinese, to put it another way, were less wedded to immunology's trope of recognizing and eliminating non-self than to vaccinology's making adjustments by giving life to something potentially pathogenic. Don't reject foreigners overtly, indeed allow them to think what they may, that you are welcoming to them, and that your smile suggests intimacy even while you practice polite social distancing to avert potential danger. And if you must be physically close to outsiders, safeguard your own karma through being extra attentive to how life flow between people. To put it in terms of intimacy and alienation, tourists and the global pandemic they can bring will always, that is, be a challenge to the Balinese that they can rise to so long as they take risks artfully. There is no need to close borders if you can manage your own household. Indeed, in the midst of COVID-19, we might do well to take a Balinese view of things. For it is true that viruses do not attack us. Like inert objects for the Balinese, they're just bits of information waiting around, sometimes for thousands of years, for the cells in our bodies to bring to life. Viruses, after all, have no motility. They cannot reproduce or even move without our bringing them to life. And that's an important lesson the Balinese taught me almost 40 years ago, but that modern science is only, by the way, now acknowledging. This being that your immune system and mine are as much search engines of difference, systems for assimilating outsiders for better or worse, than they are defense mechanisms that fuel xenophobic avoidance and social isolation. For without artfully approaching the outside, we remain wholly ignorant of its potential impact, forgetting our responsibilities to one another and remaining surprised when we fail to respond in a harmonious manner to the unexpected. And for that single lesson, I am truly grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your talk. Thank you so very much for your talk. Maybe, Ronit, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. So yeah, thank you very much for all the speakers. Perhaps we can start with questions that the speakers might have. If you do, Monica, Volker, David. If not, there are a few questions already in the chat. Volker, Monica?
I'd rather have the audience ask questions.
Okay,
I
so
already talked, yeah.
There was one question from Helen Lambert to Volker.
Yeah.
Helen, are you there? Would you like to ask your question?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Helen.
Thank you, Volker.
Hi.
Well, in terms of the last section of your interesting talk and discussing the interface between Chinese and Western medicine, something that I've observed extensively in some collaborative research in unweight movements is the use of what I've described as antivirals.
Sure.
Along with frequently administered intravenously, but not always, along with antibiotics by practitioners who see this as a way of being able, I mean, given their lack of laboratory facilities and ability to identify etiology, of treating both bacteria and viruses. So in the light of the COVID-19, your claim that, we should be thinking more broadly about the use of Chinese medicine, I don't know anything about what these antivirals are, but would they not be considered to be equally effective for a new virus?
But I don't know how they work on this new, the whole thing between bacteria and viruses in Chinese medicine and Chinese medicine is a complicated one, yes, okay, because it also ties into or it's being translated into certain ways of doing Chinese medicine. So in this whole one of the big I don't know how to say this without going into the history into detail for those who don't know the history of China, but there's a particular branch of Chinese medicine, yes, and that grew out of that encounter in the 17th century, yes, where some kind of big innovation went on, yes. It's called Wenbing, and that is very much in kind of like in the popular imagination of Chinese medicine, it's often associated with viral diseases. Yes, okay. So a lot of the herbs that are being used there are then, you know, both in the popular imagination considered to be good for virus, popular imagination amongst Chinese practitioners, but also, of course, then researched as being good for viruses. Yes. But then it also becomes problematic because some of the things that are good for viruses from a biomedical point of view, which have actually antiviral properties, they are not to be used at certain stages of the illness development in Chinese medicine, if that makes sense, because they don't correspond. They might be antiviral, but they don't correspond to the actual manifestation of the disease. Yes, okay. Then I think what you're observing in China, you know, having a trip, that's a very Chinese thing. People like to have trips, isn't it? Yes, particularly in a rural area. They wouldn't do that so much over here. So I think it's, again, a very complicated and complex constellation, yes? But one of the things you have to do whenever an epidemic comes, you have to buy certain herbs, yes? Because 2 months later, you won't be able to buy them anymore, yes? Because everybody will take these antivirals, yes? Okay, so I think, yes, I think some of them are antiviral. Whether they work for this particular virus, I don't know. And there's a very much more complex story to be told, if that makes sense, yeah?
Sure, yes, I'm sure there is. Thank you. But to your knowledge, this would be a common response, as you say.
Oh, yes. Oh,
In
yes.
this epidemic, people would be buying up and
But
using
both on the popular level, because,
it.
you know, it has everybody knows now that certain herbs are antiviral. Yes. Okay. So people would buy them by themselves. Yes. Okay. And then at different levels within the practitioner community. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
We had a question from Catherine Ibata Arendt to Monica, and some response from Bill. Monica, do you want to say anything about?
Oh, was it in the chat?
Oh, sorry, Catherine. Catherine, are you there? Here, Catherine, can you ask your question to Monica?
Oh, is
Thank
it the
you.
one? Okay.
I could just re-ask it because the chat is quite extensive. Thank you very much for everyone for hosting and for participating in this morning call for me. Monica, could you elaborate on what you had mentioned about Yunnan province as a source of a plague? I missed the timeline.
Okay. Certainly, that's the third plague pandemic. So the genetic understanding, frankly, accords really well with what had already been constructed as a historical understanding from documentary evidence, and that's the work by is it Bennett on the third plague pandemic in China. So the strains of, basically you can watch a geographical trajectory of strains of Yersinia pestis in central China, in the Qinghai Tibet plateau, and that there's an evolutionary progression as you move south from there to the strains that are now in Yunnan, and then moving eastward from there. So I think it's well documented. There's, to my knowledge, so the historical narrative was published like more than 20 years ago. To my knowledge, nobody has done the kind of work that I'm doing to re-interrogate the documentary evidence against the genetic evidence. And again, to re-emphasize, there is no ADNA, there's no historical genetic evidence that's come out of China yet. So that's something that I assume that work is underway, but nothing has been published yet.
Any other questions from anyone? Yeah, Birdie? And then Elliot, sorry.
Bettina,
Birdie Andrews.
hi, Bettina, could you are you there? So you have this question regarding ICD-11. So this kind of shift in the ICD-11 towards the pattern syndromatic definition of disease, yeah, by the WHO. Are you there?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
Ah, yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for those interesting talks, all three of them. I was just commenting on a strand of the strand of pattern recognition that Volker talked about in his talk, and I was reminded that in some moments there is a talk about pattern recognition also in the European medical tradition. And interestingly, it has been reactivated, for example, by Paul Robert Vogt, who is a Swiss clinician, as an anti-narrative against the search for the cause or for the reason or the causation of the COVID-19. Where it says so clinical training gives us a sense of pattern recognition that is being neglected by natural medicine oriented versus natural sciences, and that set me thinking, and it also brought me to the association that presently the ICD has many parts where it just puts up a syndromatic definition, because causal definitions are definitions with a very well set clinical, what we call klinisches Bild, are not possible. So what are your thoughts on that? Can you really keep to your very convincing narrative of mainstream versus the alternative or the neglected streams, or are there concurring thinking patterns? So what do you think about that?
Is question for me, yes?
Yeah.
But I think every time we do a kind of them and us, it always breaks down. So I'm very grateful that you break that down for me. You know, that's always kind of like a discursive strategy on a certain level. Yes. Okay. However, I do think there is some reality to this claim that I made. Yes. Okay. Sort of just on a very personal narrative. Take this COVID-19. Yes. So I remember when I first started practicing, which is kind of almost 40 years ago, there was this post-viral fatigue was just starting to happen, and it was not being recognized by the biomedical profession. Yes. Okay. But as you go along, it is now, yes, okay. And having seen for 30 years people with post-viral fatigue, what I'm seeing happening is that this narrative of the post-viral fatigue is being used to try and understand patients suffering from what is called the long tail of COVID-19. But simply as a clinician, it's totally clear to, I would make that claim. I could be wrong, yes, okay? But I would make as a clinician the claim that the long tail of COVID-19 is very, very different from the Epstein-Barr kind of post-viral fatigue. There are some similarities, but there are very big differences simply from the way that people present, yes, okay? And I think the claim that I wanted to make, that as a practitioner being trained in pattern diagnosis, this is what you start focusing on. This is what you see very quickly. Of course, any biomedical doctor can see that as well if they start following the symptoms rather than looking for a cause. But if you're involved in this narrative, there is a virus, and as a virus, if there's a long tail, then you get post-viral fatigue. Can you follow that? That is, yeah. But of course, if you, I think it has got nothing to do with Chinese medicine versus Western medicine. It's got to what are you trained at being focused to focus on, and what do you do when you read those manifestations? Yes, and it's not that Chinese are better than Westerners. So,
no, I didn't understand you in that way. Anyway.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I was just trying to make the point that these narratives are more parallel than
exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's a disease narrative in Chinese medicine. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I think it's really important that you made that point. Thank you.
Thank you.
So our time is nearly up, but we'll take just the 3 questions that are in the chat. So that by order that they came, actually. So Kin for David, then Birdie for Monica, and then Elliot for Volker. So Kin for David first. Kin, are you there?
Hello. Hi, I just was reflecting on an article I read recently about a symbiotic view of life. And I put the long quote there on the chat for you to follow along. So Gilbert et al. Proposes an anthropological analogy that the immune system is not merely the body's armed forces, it is also the passport control that has evolved to recognize and welcome those organisms that help the body. And this is in the discussion of how, if we look at genetically, our body is 90%, over 90% of microbes that don't belong to human DNA. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see this model of immunity reconciled with the model that you propose in your talk? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question, and I'd be very grateful. I don't see the link in the chat, but I will look for it after the talk. I know we only have a few minutes left. I guess what really intrigues me about the idea that emerged at that time is that it's really been actually confirmed by what's happened in immunology and virology over the past 30 years, and indeed the whole field of regenerative medicine, not to mention our first talk about epigenetics and the idea that the One Health models and so forth that talk quite openly about the multiplicity of organisms that the human body supports. All indicate to us that the defense mechanism notion of the immune system as a pure defense mechanism, there's a number of contradictions and paradoxes, and I don't have time to review them now. But I guess what I should say very quickly is that I'm less interested in the medical comparison of different systems of biological care than I am in the question of how diverse ways of conceptualizing pathogens has an impact on social action. And after all, let's remember that in the absence of a vaccine and outside of clinical settings, the biomedical model is not really doing much at all about COVID-19, is it? That is to say, it's almost entirely a social problem. And indeed, the recommendations that we receive are based upon social ideas about insiders and outsiders and body image boundaries and so on and so forth. And I could say a whole lot more about that, but I'm totally intrigued by any tradition that has a more complex view of the body and the way in which it's understood, and the way in which commensal organisms within the body actually have the microbiome, for example, have an impact, a significant impact on our levels of immunity. But thank you very much for the question, and I very much look forward to following up on the reference.
Thank you. So now Bridie to
thanks. Can you hear me?
Monica. Yep.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks. So I just wanted to pull us back a little bit to the pan in pandemic theme that we started with, and thank all of the presenters for their interesting observations about narrative. And so I wanted to circle back to Monica, who was sadly interrupted right in the middle of when she was introducing the idea of the importance of how we talk about global pandemics and the search for the origins and the ways in which searching for origins or the assumptions for origins can be highly problematic. And so I just wanted to ask you, Monica, if you could return to that theme, because I think that's perhaps the overarching message from this session.
This is something I have actually spent a lot of time thinking about in the past few years, because what the genetics does for me as a historian is give me answers to origin questions. It gives me answers to trajectory questions that I had as a historian, and that I and any other historian is always looking for. We're looking for, okay, what happened and how did it happen, and what factors were influences. And epidemiology is a discipline that asks very similar, and in some cases identical questions. And one of the things that I do, and let me just preface this by saying, I've been teaching the history of HIV since I started teaching history of medicine. I basically had to craft narratives on the fly when I started teaching in the 1980s. And so I watched all of those processes of narrative formation happen with HIV. And I also watched the horrific ways in which those turn to racism and homophobia and a variety of other things. Origin narratives can be weaponized. And for me, that means all the more reason why we need to think deeply about why they're important for us, why we pursue this kind of information, what other kinds of information can be revealed by that, but also when to disrupt the moral overtones of that and just say, morality isn't the issue. And what I found, and so the work that I've been doing the past decade is looking at actually several different diseases and looking at their origin stories, looking at their dissemination stories, and looking at their globalization stories, and asking myself, what do they have in common? So what does the story of tuberculosis have in common with the story of HIV, which has in common in plague and so forth? And the commonality is humans, and humans doing what humans do, which is looking for food, looking for sources of energy, looking for new things to trade, looking for love, and that's the really prosaic common layer. And then beyond that, it doesn't really. It's not. Sorry, the dog is getting a little excited about this discussion. That's the commonality, and then having said that as the commonality, it then becomes really not interesting anymore. And now we can move on to other things of what perpetuates the transmission. What are the ways in which people are not aware? I mean, because for the vast majority of the period that I work on, there is no scientific understanding of. Sorry, I'm going to take the squeaky toy away. There is no scientific understanding of these mechanisms. What is amazing watching now, and then I'll stop because I know we need to break now. What is amazing watching the COVID-19 situation now, and we have these other explanations that Volker and David have put on the table, is we have plenty of explanations of what is happening. And we have explanations about why certain responses by us as individuals, by governmental institutions, et cetera, might be effective. And yet those are being ignored by many sectors. So anyway, I think we have to engage with these discussions openly. We have to recognize the implications of them, and then move on. I think we need an ethics. I think actually we as historians need to talk about our ethics. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And thank you everyone for a really interesting discussion on the chat. Maybe some of these issues should come up in the next webinars. So just last a comment from Elliot Tokar for Volker. Elliot, are you there?
Yes, I am. Just a couple of comments on Volker's talk, and then I'd like perhaps you could give some feedback or from the other participants. So obviously, first, thanks to everyone for putting this together. In the beginning of Volker's talk, he made a particular point about the way that what he described as liberal media is reporting on the impact of traditional medicine on the treatment of COVID. And from my own experience publishing, I could say that one of the reasons for that obviously is the main input into most media outlets, whether they be liberal or even to the left, are from the biomedical establishment. So there could be a different economic or political or more progressive political point of view. When it comes to things like science, medicine, and technology, often the input is from the mainstream. And so this leads us to another point in bringing this dialogue to a broader audience, which is that I think one of the ways that as clinicians, such as myself, or as academicians, as many of the people in this talk are, we haven't done a sufficient job of inculcating the ideas, concepts, and understanding of traditional Asian medicine into the broader population. And in some way, that's more of an onus on practitioners and clinicians than necessarily on academics. And so when talking about things like differential diagnosis, which is something sought after by biomedicine, but essential to the way we practice in traditional Asian medicine, the extent to which we do approach these illnesses differently, how we approach them, what our language means, what discussions of patterns, strategies, et cetera, need to be brought to the larger population, certainly to patients, and at best also people who are writing about this in the popular media, so that when epidemics like this occur, there is a way for us to have a dialogue as opposed to an oppositional kind of relationship with the discussion that's going on overall in society.
Yeah, so thanks. On a certain level, you're totally right. So, I mean, I'm obviously wearing different hats, and it depends on what hat I wear that I would respond to you. So from a practitioner point of view, where I'm invested in Chinese medicine, I would totally endorse that, yes. If I'm more like a social observer, I'm really interested just in why is it, or why I put that here is, why in particular context is it these people who claim to be defenders of truth and of a certain kind of rationality, etc., etc., etc. Why is it okay for these people to, lie, yes, okay, in a particular context? Because what they are propagating about Chinese medicine are lies, yes, and the way they go about constructing these lies is in the same way that people would construct fake news, because they go onto certain kind of websites, because they haven't read all the historical books. They go on certain kind of websites, yes, okay, quackbuster websites. They always cite the same kind of people where they know that they will give them certain kind of answers. Yes. Okay. So are they really not interested in evidence? They claim to be defenders of evidence-based medicine, but at the same time, they find it very, very convenient to dispense with the evidence when it suits them. Yes. Okay. And that's of course at the moment, and I think at a historical moment where the kind, and to me it has got a lot to do with, these are always older white men. If you look at them, on the whole, they're older white men. Polly Toynbee, for instance, here in England, she's an older woman, but she's kind of like, belongs to that category. But on the whole, older white men. And these are, so I see that very, very much part as these old white men being threatened by what's coming out there of Asia, and COVID-19 is a particularly interesting case, because these countries, not because they're supporting Chinese traditional medicine, but the countries that are supporting traditional medicine, Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, etc. Korea, they are doing reasonably well, isn't it? Yes. Okay. So these kind of irrational countries are actually not as irrational as it seems. So I think it's just something that needs to be investigated. Yes. So thank you very much.
Okay. I think we'll close here. I want to thank all of our speakers and all of our very large audience, and everyone who's woken up very early in the morning, Monica, you especially, or stayed up very late at night. Some people in Singapore and elsewhere. We will meet again in October, and we'll pay attention to these notes, perhaps in thinking about the next webinars. Angelica, you want to say anything?
maybe just thank you so much. I think the last words of Volker were, we could just conclude with this. We will follow up in October and November, and maybe with more specific issues like medical documentation, or we will find out. You can also, we will inform you due to time, and of course, from this audience, if there would be somebody who could say, yeah, I would like to give a talk on this issue, please go ahead and ask us, run it. We will do it again, yeah?
It's just a question on recording, so this has been recorded.
Maybe,
and
yes, it's still yes, the recording.
And it will be on the IASTAM website.
Yes. Is everybody agrees? We recorded this whole session, and we will put it on the IASTAM website. And if there is somebody who doesn't want to have his voice here, please tell us in beforehand. Yes, Ronnie.
Yeah. So
thank you so much.
Farewell, everyone. Keep healthy, and see you soon somewhere.